My mom used to take me to our local mall a lot when I was a kid, both to go shopping and just to hang out. We lived in a smaller town, and my dad worked on an oil rig, so he was gone much of the time. Our mall wasn't very big and was quite old. I think it was probably built in the 60s or 70s. It was all on one level, with a lot of brickwork and these quaint storefronts. One of the places we liked to visit was this bookstore, which I won't mention the name of so as to avoid giving it a bad reputation. What happened there one day took us all by surprise, and I honestly don't blame anyone who worked there. I think it was a rainy Thursday evening, and my mom and I went there after dinner. After parking by the main entrance, we walked inside the set of double doors and into the brick foyer area. The echoes of our footsteps bounced off the walls. There was a cozy ambiance. The mall was laid out in a rectangular shape, with the hall on one side being the main walkway and the one on the opposite side being this narrow back corridor. It honestly looked like a service area. The bookstore was in the center and was the mall's biggest store. It also had this little decorative bell tower-like thing that you could see from the outside of the mall, though I don't think there were actually any bells in there. On the inside, there was an opening in the ceiling in roughly the middle of the store. Looking up it, all you could see was plain drywall on each side and a light fixture at the top. There weren't any ladders or stairs, so I assumed that if someone had to do maintenance up there, they had to bring their own ladder. My mom and I actually used to make up stories about who might live at the top, and we always walked over underneath the opening and looked up into it each time we went to the mall. It was just a fun ritual my mom and I did. Anyway, on this particular night, it was already pretty dark, and you could hear the rain hitting the roof. When we walked over to the opening, the sound of the rain got louder. Standing directly in the center was almost like being in a sound booth. I stood there for a moment, just laughing with my mom, but what happened next was straight out of a horror movie. While I was looking back at her, I heard a bang come from somewhere up in the tower. Instinctively, I looked up. For a moment I didn't see anything, but then I saw a round shape move out from one of the edges near the top of the tower. It was a face. I screamed, and my mom instinctively ran towards me and picked me up. She must have thought something was about to fall down on me, but when I told her I saw a person up there, she screamed too. An employee came over as we explained there was someone hiding at the top of the tower. The lady was clearly freaking out as well as she tried to call someone on her radio. Eventually she got in touch with the other employees and they ushered everyone outside of the bookstore and locked the doors. We didn't stick around to wait for the cops. Instead, my mom insisted on getting me out of there. A cop did show up to our house later that evening and we spoke with him for a few minutes. The cop told us that they did in fact find someone hiding up there. He didn't go into a lot of details, and when my mom asked the cop how he got there, he said he didn't know. The cop asked me to provide a description of what I witnessed, but all I could tell him was that I heard a banging sound, and then a minute later that guy peeked out from somewhere near the top of the tower. I couldn't even give that good of a description since he was so far away. We didn't go back to the mall for a while, but eventually when we did, we saw that the opening in the ceiling had been covered. Now there was just an entrance like to someone's attic. Even though I managed to get over what happened, my mom would always get a bit nervous when we went to the bookstore. I'm not even sure it had to do with that guy hiding up there. Rather, I think it was because she thought something was about to fall on me. Anyway, this happened like 15 years ago now, and I've already graduated college, so I don't think about it that much anymore. However, it still stands as one of the most bizarre things to have ever happened to me in my life. Back in high school, my friends and I would frequent our local mall. It was never super busy, and I think might even be on its way out now, but we still enjoyed going there. On one particular day, I was there with my 3 friends, who all called Jessica, Aubrey, and Janet. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we were eating in the food court. We noticed this set of scaffolds leading up to the ceiling with a guy dressed in all white at the top, who we assumed was a painter. He was also wearing a white mask, and while this was before the whole pandemic thing, I just thought it was to prevent him from breathing in paint fumes. We watched him out of curiosity while we got and then ate our food, but for the longest time he seemed to just stand there, facing the wall. Finally, when we were almost done eating, we saw him take something from one of the pockets in his pants, which turned out to be a can of red spray paint. He started spraying, and we watched him intently as he did this. A moment later we burst out into laughter, as the guy was apparently writing F-U-C-K. We heard other outbursts from across the food court as a few other people apparently took notice. After he finished writing the K, the guy actually sat back down, facing the wall. I'm pretty sure all of us expected him to start writing something else, or come back down the ladder on the scaffolding, but instead he just stood there. Eventually someone from the mall, I think a manager, came over and called up to the guy to get down. He didn't though. At this point none of us knew what the guy was doing. Jessica thought he was recording a prank, while Janet thought this was some kind of protest, but none of us were sure. After 30 seconds or so of the manager asking the guy to come down and him not moving, the manager took out his phone, presumably to call security, but just then the guy on the scaffolding got up and turned around. People started screaming, and I looked up to see him holding a gun. Immediately people got up and ran, and Jessica, Aubrey, and Janet and I ran too. As we made our way to the entrance near the food court, we heard someone shouting. I think it was a mall cop. He was yelling for the man to put the gun down and climb down the ladder. My heart was racing as we got outside and into Aubrey's car. Aubrey started it the moment she got inside, but we had to be careful leaving the parking lot as everyone else was running around and getting in their vehicles too. We started texting everyone we knew, and when Aubrey dropped me off at my house and I told my mom, she started freaking out. As we learned later, the man was mentally disturbed. Thank God the gun hadn't actually been loaded. I don't think we ever learned what his motive was, if there even was one, and I'm pretty sure he went back to some kind of mental institution. It just goes to show that, no matter where you are or what you are doing, danger can be right around the corner. My name's Blake and I used to be a mall cop, and eventually ended up working the overnight shift. Honestly, I preferred to be alone, and found ways to occupy my time. Sometimes it did get a bit creepy, which maybe was the worst aspect of it. Overall it wasn't that bad, at least until one night, which to this day I still have no complete explanation for. I'd been in my job for about 4 months and would arrive right before the mall closed at 8 p.m. to start my night shifts. By that time most of the patrons had left, with the exception being the indoor play area. For context, our mall was relatively large and in the suburbs, and was relatively busy most days. Especially in the hottest and coldest months of the year, there'd usually be a congregation of families there. It was off to one side on the lower level, and the upper level walkway ran around the edge above it, so you could look up all the way to the ceiling of the mall. The playscape had a few slides and a raised walkway on a rubber flooring area, and there were benches for parents and stuff like finger mazes and gears along the outside. Apparently a local artist had come in and painted cartoon characters on the walls behind the benches, and overall it was really well done. There'd usually be at least a few families left at closing, and part of my duties would be to make sure they all left. This one particular night started off as usual, and when I got to the play area, there were like 3 families. I actually knew one of them, as this particular dad and his 2 young daughters would come here often. The 2 kids recognized me and started joking with their dad that it was time to go, and he picked one of them up and led the other away by the hand. They all waved to me as I left, which legit was one of the most heartwarming things that happened to me while working there. That just left 2 families, or what I thought were 2 families. There was one woman who looked to be in her 30s sitting on one of the benches, a younger dude in his 20s on one of the benches on the other side, and 3 little kids running through the playscape. I made an announcement that the mall was now closing, and that everyone still present had to leave. The little kids immediately started protesting, and the woman looked up from her phone and told them they needed to go. All 3 of them came over to the lady, and they got up and left a moment later. That just left the dude, who I guess was there all by himself. I'm not saying our mall didn't have its share of creeps, but some guy just waiting by himself in the play area at closing time was extra creepy. He was also just staring across at the other wall with a completely blank expression on his face. I made another announcement, trying to make it sound like I was still directing it at the general public, even though that man was the only one still there. The dude still didn't budge though. My heart started racing as the thought that this guy was possibly nuts and carrying a weapon crossed my mind. For context, I did have a taser, but I never had to or imagined I would have to use it. I started walking slowly in the guy's direction, stopping about 10 feet in front of him. I told him we were closed and that he needed to leave. Finally he looked at me, though still without saying a word. I'm not sure if he was trying to smile or if his face just twitched, but his expression was still almost completely blank. Then he appeared to nod and got up slowly before turning and heading in the direction of the nearby escalators. I waited for him to get about halfway up, and then I walked over to the escalator as well. This voice inside my head was telling me that I needed to make sure he left the building. As I got to the top of the escalator, I realized that the guy had stopped right before reaching the entrance. Again, I felt my heart rate rise, and I mentally prepared myself for some kind of confrontation. I began walking towards him, and when he still didn't move, I asked him if he was alright. Then, without turning around or saying a word, he kept walking to the doors, walking out both sets and into the parking lot. I waited about 10 seconds before walking to the outer set of doors and locking them, all the while keeping watch on the man. I began to relax when I saw him get into a car and drive away a moment later. I waited for a minute or two before walking back into the main part of the mall and doing one last check for any shoppers still left in the building. It seemed like he was the last shopper, assuming he had bought something anyway. Most of my job consisted of making rounds through the building, and I'd have 45 minutes to get from one side to the other and scan this barcode at either end. By the time I finished my first round, it was almost 9, and only 1 or 2 store employees were still there. I debated whether or not to ask them about the man, but ultimately decided it wasn't worth worrying them. Nothing unremarkable happened for the next several hours, but right before I had to go on one of my car patrols, I thought I heard a sound from somewhere out in the darkness. I had no idea what it was or what direction it came from. The mall was laid out like a giant plus sign, and I was by the food court near the middle and the upper level. I immediately stopped and shined my light around, but all I saw in the food court was the deserted tables with chairs stacked on top and empty restaurants. Next, I shined my light at the shops on the other side across the balcony, but didn't see anything there either. Then I walked out onto one of the walkways near the exact middle of the plus sign so I could see down each of the corridors. Absolutely nothing. I called out, "Is anyone there?" but got no response. Just as I was starting to second guess myself, I heard it again. This time I was reasonably certain it was coming from the corridor leading to the play area, which incidentally was where I needed to go. I made the connection with that creepy dude from earlier, and a chill ran up my spine. I began to walk in that direction, and eventually came to the section of walkway right above the playscape, and then I stopped and held my breath. I didn't hear that sound again, but do you ever get the sense that it can be quiet without being dead quiet? That's what I felt. I couldn't specifically hear anything, but I got the sense there was some low ambient noise. I turned my flashlight on and then shined it all around. There didn't seem to be anything else on the upper level, so I shined my light down onto the play area. As I did so, I felt my heart start to race. The flashlight cast eerie shadows as it moved through the playscape, and any moment I knew that guy would come popping out from somewhere, but he didn't. I called out, "Is there anyone out there?" and got no response. Something about my words echoing into the darkness was moderately terrifying. I turned the light off and just stood there in darkness for a moment, thinking. I tried my best to listen, and while I still couldn't hear anything, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some very faint noise in the background somewhere. I must have waited there for over a minute, but when I still couldn't determine anything, I turned my flashlight back on and walked over to one of the hallways near the nearby entrance, which led to where I had to scan the barcode thing. But just then, I heard something. I'm not sure if it was the same noise as before, but I could hear it a lot more clearly now. It was footsteps. It was strange though. It didn't sound like someone walking on carpet or tile. While trying not to panic, I made my way to the little service hallway and quietly unlocked the door and stepped inside. I shined the light down the hallway, and after confirming no one was there, I shut the door in front of me and took out my phone. I dialed 911. I reported that someone had broken into the mall and was possibly mentally unstable. The operator asked me to describe the suspect, and I told her I couldn't as they were hiding from me, but I strongly suspected it was one of the people hanging out in that area at closing time. Eventually, I made my way to one of the outside service entrances where I met 2 cops when they arrived. We walked back in, and I turned on all the lights from one of the control panels in that area. I accompanied them back through that same door, and they loudly announced their presence. They moved out onto the walkways over the play area and called out for whoever was there to walk to where they could see them. No one did. Now I was sure I heard footsteps before, so I figured that person probably just left, but then one of the cops shouted. There, on this little walkway area by the skylights and decorations on the ceiling, was a figure dressed in all black. The other cop immediately yelled for that person to stay where they were and to put their hands up. They didn't though, and instead ran towards the end of the walkway out of view. While one of the cops continued trying to order the person to stop, the other asked me how to gain access to that area, but I had no idea. I hadn't even known there was a way to get up there before. The cops called for backup as we tried to figure out how to gain access. I called management, and eventually 5 more cops showed up and 2 people from the mall company. We were all stumped as to how that person got up there. and finally one of the mall people got in contact with someone over the phone and figured out that the access point was within the nearby anchor store. I unlocked the gate and got a ladder and managed to find what ceiling tiles had to be removed. Then 2 of the cops went up onto this narrow walkway and a few moments later made it through to the area by the ceiling outside the store. We all kind of felt a little sense of accomplishment as we'd been pulling our collective hair out, but whoever had snuck in was long gone. Now things were already pretty strange, but arguably they got a lot stranger. The following day, the police and mall management began a more thorough investigation. But even now, no one has any idea how or why that person snuck in. The mall did have security cameras, including at all the major entrances, but that person never showed up on any of them. Our best guess was that he snuck in at some point while the mall was open and then waited, but that still left the question of, how did that person sneak out? There was about an hour before when the cops and I spotted him by the ceiling and when I unlocked the gate to the anchor store, so the man could have easily gotten there. But the security cameras didn't see anyone leaving the building by that entrance, and the cops did thoroughly search the inside of that store. That left 2 possibilities. Either that person snuck out across the parking lot in one of the blind spots between cameras, or they waited somewhere, presumably until morning, and then used the crowd as cover to leave. Of those 2 theories, I consider it more likely that they left immediately. However, that raised the question of how they knew where the blind spots between cameras were, and suggested they had worked at the mall at some point. The mall management interviewed everyone who worked at the mall and reviewed the files of people who worked there previously, but there weren't any leads. I was involved in the investigation a little bit, and for the week following this incident, there were actual cops who worked the night shift with me. I worked as a mall cop there for about 3 more months, but never saw anything suspicious again. There are still so many questions left unanswered. Who was that person? Not just how, but why did they sneak in? Was that person actually the same guy that was hanging out at the mall play area? In my mind that seems likely, since I had never seen that guy before or since this happened, but I can't prove it. Maybe he didn't like it when I told him he had to leave? But even if it was the same guy, how did he get back in? I know it'll always be a mystery. I'm not really bothered by it, I'm just curious. And I know I'll always wonder.